I recently had a discussion with someone where I was explaining some elements of my metatype architecture, and it was almost quite cathartic for me because I was at the same time speculating as to um, perhaps some therapeutic measures of how essentially this knowledge can inform management of something like that, and this is still sort of a, to a large part speculative because I'm not exactly sure what I should be thinking about these models and these structures. But anyway, going through these things, I kind of it unlocked a lot of insight for me because talking how the sides of the mind interrelate with one another and where they all come from in terms of the superego, it really opened up perspectives that I hadn't really considered before. One of these things was just, in some sense, it's so complicated, the structure of the false ego complex, that just talking through it and giving overviews of it, allow me to kind of see different elements of it as more. I'm starting to get a nice narrative, a nice sort of overall integrated, contextualized sort of digestion of the subject matter. Um, and something that was very interesting to me was just how essentially you can almost summarize someone's personality style by their superego's parent function, essentially by what I also refer to as the prime false prophet. Um, I think I might try to give as best I can a kind of reproduction of what I said, because I think some of those, I think that they're probably in things that I've already recorded, but it might be worth it just to kind of re-emphasize those sorts of more salient features. But so I was discussing essentially how I saw the role of the inferior functions, the various inferior functions through the different side of the mind, and how the parent function is basically responsible for which side of the mind uh, becomes prominent, um, or ascendant, or sort of it, because then the other parent functions and the other inferior functions um, essentially lose all credibility if the prior inferior functions are not relegated into the death, because it is the death of one inferior function. That's a strange way of saying it. It is the conversion of one side of the mind's inferior function into the death that becomes the hard limit, that becomes essentially uh, the structure that becomes the edifice for the next side of the mind. And so essentially, one side of the mind's, or one prior side of the mind's inferior function has to be repurposed. Uh, and it has to cease being an inferior function effectively in order for the next side of the mind to become operative or to become sort of accessible. Essentially, without the repurposing of the inferior function of some other side of the mind, you don't get a child function in the new side of the mind. Where was I? So, and essentially, the beginning point of this is that the parent function of the superego, in some sense, it's hard for me to say that it's really part of the false ego complex, because it's something like the initial fictitious move which sets everything else in motion, because essentially the inferior function and the sin of the superego's parent function is immediately donated to the subconscious to serve as the subconscious's child function, and death. It's death and it's lust, and the lust is the child function. Now, let me just define what lust is. So, lust is not a sexual thing. It's almost like a kind of it's a very sort of abstract kind of use of the word, perhaps, but I think it is correct in its spiritual sense. So my understanding of what the lust is that the lust is a direct consequence of the death. That essentially, if you, the death is basically like a rule. It's like a limit. It's a hard limit that you believe um, must be upheld or must be structurally made real within, within the context of a cognitive function. So within the context of a particular dimension of psychological reality, if that is prone to a death, you have kind of costed something into reality. You've kind of created an external locus of control to some degree in relation to that cognitive function. So you've created a kind of a symbolic representation as to an indicative uh, there's some kind of uh, measurement which is indicated uh, by some kind of symbolism, by some kind of image, by some kind of test. So there's some kind of objective test which sort of supplements the living operation of that cognitive function. So that cognitive function is subject to a death because it is functionally dormant, because it's no longer operable, it's only testable. So you have to test for some symbolic indication, which then tells you as to the state or that gives you a measurement. It gives you sort of a magnitude uh, on that according to that test. And so in some sense you've actually displaced the actual organic functioning of that dimension of psychological reality. Anyway, when that happens, there's a natural gap which is created. Essentially, the next dimension of psychological reality that follows from the death is what I call the lust. And essentially, because the death is so, let's say, complete in itself, it's so self-satisfied in some sense, it leaves a kind of it leaves a barren wasteland in front of it. And in some sense, that barren wasteland could be understood as a free gift in some sense. It's just a kind of, it's a windfall, it's a boon, it's a kind of, it doesn't matter, it becomes inconsequential. So it's sort of the death casts a shadow, and essentially that shadow is a kind of a domain that is without significance or importance in some sense. Or that's probably the wrong way to put it, but it's a better way to put it is that you create a gap that has no integrity in some sense. So you create a dimension of psychological reality that is devoid of. You can just subject it to whatever whim you so wish to do. You can use it and you can abuse it. It's a kind of unlimited exploitation. So essentially, and I roughly usually describe it like this: is because the death is like a rule book. But essentially, if you know all the rules, but you get to toy with them for long enough, you can always find a way to kind of subvert them. You can find a way to exploit them. You can find a way to contrive them in such a way in order to make them work for you. And so it's kind of like that's what the lust is that it's a field in which there are no limits. There's an unlimited use of that field, and therefore you have the free reign, essentially, to interpret the rules in such a way that you can exploit them. And so there's a real sense of infinite power that you have through the use of the cognitive function that is subject to the lust. Now, the problem is that you can use the lust in that way. The problem is that the one thing that it can't have is that it can't understand what it's doing in itself, because it kind of loses integrity. So essentially, by using this unlimited source of power and exploitation of the death in some sense, it loses track of itself. So it becomes meaningless. It becomes kind of vacuous. So it's so all powerful that it kind of is problematic. And anyway, that problem only shows itself much later on, because essentially the next step in the chain is the vanity. And the vanity really has to even understand, eventually the vanity will understand the toxicity of the lust. And in some sense, the role of the parent function, which is the enticed lust, which comes after the vanity, is to somewhat try to appease the model of reality that the vanity has construed, which is trying to kind of serve the lust. This is archetypally described as the great city of Babylon, or Babylon the Great. And you can imagine that the lust is almost archetypally like the whore of Babylon, which is essentially the queen, but she's not called the queen because she doesn't have integrity. So she is de facto the queen, but she doesn't have the title. But all the rich men and kings of the great city are drunk on the wrath of the fornication with the whore. And so, it's that's the relationship between the vanity and the lust, is that the vanity is full of all these intellectual conceptualizations. I mean, this is a kind of abstract metaphor, but it's full of having to create a value system. It has to create a full system so that it can operate, so that it can know what it's dealing with. It has to kind of label everything. It has to identify what things are. But essentially, if you put that all together, they end up having to find a way to become inebriated, to become drunk, because essentially the more immediate service that they render to the whore, they get angry. It makes them wroth. They are wroth from they get wrath from fornicating with the lust. They get angry, but then they have to learn to acclimatize themselves to that wrath, and so they actually get drunk on it. It is like a depressant, it makes them lose their senses, so they kind of become numb to the wrath, and they end up becoming addicted to that numbness. They become and so this is the uneasy relationship between the dominant function and the child function. And in some sense, the parent function is really trying to fight, let's say, the kind of the people that might reform the system, the people that might say this whole thing is structurally unsound, which is effectively, let's say, the aspects of reality which are trying to the great city, which are effectively which is symbolized by the inferior function. And if you were to reckon with the trial, it would precipitate the sin. You would understand how you have missed your own mark, how you haven't even served the lust itself, that the whole thing is a shambles, it doesn't even work in concept. But that kind of cognitive dissonance is facilitated by the parent function trying to distance the inferior function from the hero function. And in some sense, what the parent function is trying to do is it actually tries to adopt the role of the inferior. It actually tries to sort of supplant what, I mean, in some sense, you can understand that on a weird kind of metaphorical sense, the parent function is trying to perform the role of the inferior function. It's trying to it's trying to displace the use of the inferior function through the parent function. Um, so it's trying to convert, uh, having to utilize, so the parent function wants to make a nice, beautiful excuse as to why the inferior function can just be laid to rest and avoided and not brought up, so it can be just forgotten, essentially. And if the parent function is not able to forget the inferior function, then what it must instead do is it must kind of give itself up. It has to kind of create a new side of the mind. And so it has to say, okay, well, this inferior function is just, I've surrendered to it. It actually, I can't displace it. I can't sort of use my own self instead of it. I just have to accept that there are certain things about the inferior function which are just undeniable. And as soon as it makes that undeniable premise, that becomes a new death for the next side of the mind. Okay. And then from that death is a new lust. And then you kind of have a new scenario to deal with. Now, I just want to emphasize this, and I've kind of said this before, but it's worth saying again, that um, I have generally said what each theme of the side of the mind is. That the subconscious, I believe, is kind of like your sense of of yourself, is your sense natively in yourself of what you prefer, what you want, your internal preferences, your internal drive, what you privately actually feel. It's the truest sense of yourself and your preferences, your actual inclinations at core. And then the unconscious side of the mind, I think, is like morality. It's like you have to look at yourself from the outside. You have to imagine yourself from looking at yourself from a third person perspective, or putting yourself in a kind of in a retrospective contemplative paradigm, that you're looking at yourself in terms of how you would judge yourself from the outside, essentially. So you looking at the story of yourself and judging the story. So you're kind of trying to create an objective kind of paradigm. And then the third thing is the ego, which I thematically generally describe as the kind of it's a bit of both, that comes after both, that it tries to integrate both of these perspectives, and it tries to say, okay, well, now that I have the insight of the unconscious side of the mind, now I actually have to decide how I'm going to synthesize or integrate these things into a performative role. What is the mask that then I should wear on my subconscious? So essentially the ego, in some sense, is like, after being informed by the unconscious side of the mind, um, is going to is going to ask the question, what is worth actualizing in something like that? And the ego is certainly in a special position, because it can't really develop safely, because if it has to accept its inferior function, it knows that it's completely lost, because essentially the sin of the ego is a terminal sin. It doesn't lead to a new side of the mind. So it really doesn't want to have to put up with its inferior function. And I think that specifically, uh, the the dominant function, the parent function, and the inferior function, and the sin, are all in some sense almost in a state of limbo, and that is actually what people have in their minds. Like, when people are actually thinking in their minds in the immediate sense, the only freedom that they have in their archetype, in their type architecture, is those parts of the ego, not the lust of the ego, because the child function of the ego is essentially inherited from uh, from the sin of the unconscious side of the mind. It is being repurposed, and it is part of, let's say, this internal drama that involves the parent functions and such. Um, and so, in some sense, the parent function in the ego is very important, and it is under a lot of tensions, or under a lot of internal stress between the sides of the mind, and because it doesn't want to look at the inferior function in the ego, but it somewhat has to deal with the other sides of the mind's inferior functions, or it has to make sure that its perspective only becomes relevant if the other inferior functions stay in their death form rather than emerging as their kind of inferior function form, because as soon as they kind of um, act as an inferior function, then you kind of regress into that earlier side of the mind, which will be there's probably nice psychology words that I could use that I don't know offhand, but it kind of dysregulation of identity. When you regress, you kind of, because when you go into an that kind of involution, you're not negating the higher structures. They're still there. They just kind of become passive and dormant. And then, so when you regress and you're dealing with that inferior function, you can also unsettle yourself. You can, so if you actually overcome that tension, then when you go back to the ego, now you might have done something which kind of invalidates, creates a kind of non sequitur in some internal structure in the ego. Anyway, this was a slight tangent, but it's also worth going into. My point of bringing all this stuff up is so generally speaking, your ego is in the state that you choose it to be in, because you can really consciously direct what's happening in your ego, specifically in the dominant function of the ego, the parent function of the ego, the inferior, and the sin. But obviously the inferior and the sin, there's a natural problem with dealing with those, because if you deal with the inferior function, you might regress into the old sides of the mind, because if your parent function kind of in your ego function sort of gives a lifeline to past inferior functions of the other sides of the mind, and they kind of emerge as inferior functions, then the whole ego focus just kind of disintegrates, and you have a kind of involution. Um, so the parent function can't be too lax. It can't be too laissez-faire. It has to kind of be responsible, and it has to. So that's the most sort of precarious thing, is I would say the parent function in the ego, because if it starts being too irresponsible, then essentially the child function of the ego sort of evaporates, and you regress to an earlier child function in one of the prior sides of the mind. Anyway, for all your trouble, if you actually develop, let's say, your ego in a well matured way, the problem is that your sin, essentially, the sin of the ego is, quite weirdly, the death of the superego, which never existed. I think ontologically, the superego starts at the parent function, but essentially the sin gives you a kind of a glimpse, if you actually develop the sin in the ego function properly enough, which I think is very important. And it generally follows what I keep on describing as perfecting the vanity. But anyway, is essentially making your vanity have to kind of accept the damage that is done to it from the inferior function, and trying to reconcile the inferior function with the vanity, which will at the same time in some sense, which means that the parent function has to play its role almost perfectly, because it has to do its job with regard to the other inferior functions, but according to its local inferior function, it has to allow the vanity to be damaged by it. So you kind of need a weird kind of discipline around the parent function. And what this will also do is it will basically turn the vanity against the lust. It will turn the vanity against the child, essentially. So you're allowing the child function uh, to be debunked in some sense. Um, and I think the kind of it's very hard to do this at the ego, because if you try to do this at the ego, the other sides of the mind will also have their internal, because you kind of, this is all built on the foundation of the last side of the mind. So if you try to integrate the ego, at the same time the structural flaws in the unconscious and the subconscious might need to be tended to. So you might need to regress and also restructure that, so that you can go back to developing the ego. And I think eventually what this does is, by the way, I don't think that the sin of the ego, which is the death of the superego, in some sense, that gives you an existential clue, but it doesn't. I don't think that that is actually the solution to anything. I think it kind of lets you see behind the curtain, or it gives you a glimmer behind the curtain of the Wizard of Oz. But essentially, I think that the way to actually fix everything is to understand how you are being played by this fictitious entity of the prime false prophet, which is the parent of the superego. And so if you can just understand, and I think that this is a good way of summarizing what people's types are, is that you can almost understand that everyone's emotional, if you also look at my emotional tone analysis of people, of personality, that those emotional tones are in terms of their metaphysical cognitive makeup and things like that, and how they are a structure and a circuit, you can almost summarize them as that the purpose of that circuit in aggregate in summation, is that they are coping with an external locus of control, which basically amounts to the false prophet, the prime false prophet in the superego, the parent function of the superego. And so you can almost understand that essentially the whole false ego complex is a coping mechanism for an external locus of control, a god of the world, as you will. Um, so to having this. Let me just narrate this slightly, because it might just make it more accessible to think about. Essentially, what I'm saying is that what young children do, very, very young children, even young infants, is they anthropomorphize their environment. And they do this by relenting or sacrificing a part of their cognitive ability, one of their cognitive functions, essentially. They start addressing it as another person. It's kind of like an imaginary friend, but it's made up of their own internal resources in terms of their consciousness. So they are making a kind of idolatry out of one of their potential cognitive perspectives and cognitive faculties. So they're dressing up one of their cognitive faculties as a representative of their environment. So they're saying, so essentially they have a part of themselves that they can question. They can say, well, why did this happen to me? Why is life this way? Why is determinism happening? Because they've created a fictitious entity inside of themselves out of one of their cognitive functions. They've created an idolatry, essentially, a kind of a mind constructed idolatry. And so now, when they are actually talking to that thing, I would call that essentially they're talking to the false prophet. They're talking to a voice in their head which is talking in the tone of this cognitive function, which is channeling that kind of cognitive function. And eventually I think that this entity blends into the background. It just becomes part of your experience. You kind of forget about it, so it just kind of, it becomes the environmental shadow in some sense. Uh, and that is specifically what happens is the more responsibility you take for developing an internal locus of control in response, in reaction to this environmental shadow, which now you've forgotten about. So it becomes the shadow, it becomes unconscious, but it used to be conscious. But the thing is that the problem is that it wasn't even a fully fledged thing. It wasn't a fully fledged personality. It was a fragment of a personality. It was like a puppet. So it was like, well, under the postulate that I am secretly in control of everything, and I am now talking to a representative of that control of everything. Um, and so there's a part of uh, psychological operation which uh, you have kind of projected onto a perennial other, a perennial environment, a metaphysical environmental consciousness. But that consciousness is also sort of half formed. So I don't think, it's an argument whether this is the God of the world or the false prophet, but I would say essentially the false prophet is just the emissary of the God of the world, and the God of the world exists as a concept, but because it's essentially a lie, it's a fiction, it's never real. So in some sense, its representative is more real than the concept itself. But you can kind of complete the concept philosophically or metaphysically. But essentially, in practice it's problematic because it's. I mean, I guess this is why they also call it the God of lies, the spirit of man. Anyway. Anyway. The But yeah, so it's interesting that essentially I think that might be then if you, I mean, I think I've played with the structure and the architecture of the false ego complex for long enough. I think there is something to the understanding that the death is really the fundamental problem because it's the death that is actually creating the lust. And so, and then, and then essentially, what is the cause of the first death, the death in the subconscious, is the donation of, in some sense, reacting to the false prophet. I should have said some more things about the lust, because I mean the reason why I'm talking about this stuff is because I think that this might be something of the recipe of a therapeutic intervention, or how it would actually be resolved, the false ego complex. So I think what you would do is you would understand that essentially the lust is the source of the pathology in the false ego complex, but the lust itself is a symptom of the death. And you do have to at some point stop the lust, but if you don't discharge the death, uh, I don't see how you can avoid the lust. I don't think it's possible because essentially the lust is the potential that is created from the death. And in some sense, the lust itself doesn't even it has so little integrity. It has zero integrity. So all of its characteristics are almost a projection from beneath the lust, which is coming from the death itself. So the support that the death is providing to the lust becomes the overriding imprint that the lust kind of just sort of ends up sort of becoming its lowest common denominator sort of characteristic, or its set of properties, or all the tributes that have been granted to it from the death. The death, another way of understanding the death is, I think there's a direct link between the death and the beast in terms of archetypal language, because the beast is conditioned by its environment. It has no free will. Its freedom is dead. It does not. It is not alive in the sense that there is no choice, there is no liberty, there is no reason. Um, its thinking is completely conditioned uh, by its environment. It has no internal locus of control, and it just so I mean, it really a big solution to solving all these things is cultivating an internal locus of control, which is paradoxically elaborating the pathology of the false ego complex, which you have to, I believe that you have to develop the false ego complex. Once you have one, you have to complete it and develop it nicely so that you have something to uh, essentially disentangle and extricate yourself from it. But if it remains unfinished, essentially, so it's almost like within the false ego complex, you have to grow the seed of an internal locus of control until it cannot uh, until the pattern of that growth becomes until it breaks the mold, as it were, until it is I think this is what the spirit of man is, in some sense. Sorry, not the spirit of man, the son of man. The son of man has to be grown within the spirit of man, which is the false ego complex, essentially. Um, or the son of man, at least, comes from leaving the false ego complex behind, but uh, it, it at some point needs to be able to find a form within the spirit of man that is capable of sacrificing itself and being reborn as the son of man, something like that. But let me just talk about this. So yeah, so ironically, essentially, once you've got a super ego, I think that you need to start developing the positive side of the false ego complex in order to convert that external locus of control, which is kind of like an unknown, into an internal locus of control, which then essentially becomes like a known unknown. And then essentially, when you know that you can't know certain things because the form of your structure is pathological, then out of a kind of conscious move, you can repudiate and rebuke the false ego complex, and also then have the confidence essentially to lead captivity captive and essentially place the prime prophet, the prime false prophet, into the lake of fire. And thus removing this weird kind of unknown external locus of control, and because you've converted, because you have a full understanding of the external locus of control, so it becomes a known external locus of control, which then you can confine to the lake of fire. So essentially you have to understand the full width and breadth and every trick in the false prophet's arsenal by exploring the false ego complex, by fully developing it and knowing it backwards and knowing exactly how it's pathological, so that essentially when you inculcate it into a perspective with essentially so that you know what you're locking away, because essentially you can't throw away the baby with the bathwater. The point of placing the false prophet into the lake of fire is so that you can actually regain an internal locus of control over that dimension. So in some sense, I think that the prime false prophet, as it corresponds to a certain dimension of psychological reality, that is the full metaphysical, that is the work of salvation, essentially. That is where real growth needs to occur. But you have to come up a lot of stumbling blocks and obstacles and challenges to confront that final completed step. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this I think has clicked for me recently, that the real solution is the prime false prophet, is extricating that external locus of control over that cognitive function, over that dimension. Which would effectively undo the death and the lust of the subconscious, which then would probably unravel everything else. Or essentially, so I mean, I think at some point you have to conceptually understand the structure of all the internal problems in your false ego complex. And then you have to sort of remove the linchpin, and then, because you've kind of already conceptually sort of understood the roadmap in terms of having a known external locus of control over knowing exactly how your false ego complex operates internally and its internal stresses and its various vying perspectives that kind of infernally plague each other, and the kind of all the different internal tensions. But essentially, after you've removed the linchpin, then I'm not neatly describing this at all, but essentially you can let go of those concerns and structures, because you have a new way of interfacing. With your own psychology, essentially. And you are a new creature at that point, essentially, a new spiritual creature. And in some sense, it's, it's the discovery of the true name of your consciousness, you could say as well, and a mastery over being able to choose. This is going to sound strange, I guess, but sort of choose your decisions. In being full ownership over your character. And when I say ownership, I essentially mean responsible, a kind of a fully actualized, free agent, and then responsible in a way that is justifiable and substantiated within being able to ground and anchor claims of what is true from the constitution of your character. And you have a way of accounting for all these dynamic sort of internal processes and things like that. Anyway, okay, I've spoken for long enough. Yeah, so I think that's roughly. I mean, so I guess I'm becoming more hopeful about therapy on these lines. But yeah, I think I was actually, I think, getting quite depressed because I was almost looking for inspiration, and I couldn't find a particular window of opportunity as to what to be done about it. I think something that I said was depressing. Something that I said in an earlier recording was depressing me when I essentially said that is this just going to be managed? Is the false ego complex is the best that we can do? Is just to work out how to manage it, or something like that. And I think even saying that and kind of been pondering this, that because I really do have a deep-seated repulsion to the false ego complex. I just knew that it was that even saying that the idea that this can just somehow be managed is undignified. That if it cannot be overturned, if it cannot be broken, it's yeah. So I mean, I guess I was almost meditating on that subconsciously, and I think it was actually very depressing. But anyway. I didn't finish something that I was talking about in the last recording, so I'm just going to continue talking because actually there are a lot of other important facets that are worth bringing up and emphasizing and things. But the thing that I didn't talk about is how the themes of each side of the mind, that is a theory of mine. That is a generalization. It's not, I shouldn't say theory. What I mean is that is a rough generalization, and it's not true in practice. And this is why people, I believe, have very undeveloped egos, is because you see, if you run into the problem, if your parent function in your subconscious eventually is getting to grips with the fact that its inferior function is offering a certain kind of undeniable problem for its hero function, for its local hero function, and it just can't work out how to avoid it anymore, and it just wants to concede to the inferior function, it ends up sort of facilitating the next side of the mind by converting that inferior function into a death. And so when it wants to convert that inferior function into a death and therefore support the development of a whole new side of the mind, a new whole entity, a new whole perspective, it might not be. So, I mean, if I'm talking about the subconscious transition to the unconscious side of the mind, I've said that the unconscious side of the mind thematically is like morality, is like seeing yourself from beyond yourself. Now, the reason why I say that is because to me it is a useful way to integrate two sides of the mind, because they both inhabit very different domains. The one is the domain of the internal inclination and preference, and the other one is being able to look at yourself from beyond yourself, from a third person perspective, from some kind of objective contemplative framework, from the narrative of your life or something like that. So I believe that the unconscious should take on that kind of theme, because then it's not going to have problems of integrating with the subconscious, that the one can be layered on top of the other without creating direct negations. It will kind of create a sophisticated overlay, a commentary on the subconscious, but it's not going to butt heads directly against the subconscious. But it might be the case that people might try to use the unconscious side of the mind just like the subconscious. They might just, well, the subconscious failed, let me try to do the same thing on the unconscious. They try to treat their unconscious like a new attempt at the subconscious. And I think that if you do this, you get tied up in an arrested development. You get entangled, and you can never develop a proper ego function, because you've got two sides of the mind that are trying to do the same thing, and they will just completely tear each other apart all the time. So essentially, as soon as the parent function in the unconscious tries to deal with its inferior function, and it fails to do so, then the subconscious is just going to kind of be reinvigorated, and as soon as the subconscious is reinvigorated, it has to kind of try to displace all the structures. So the parent function of the subconscious and the parent function of the unconscious will be in a kind of incommensurate invalidation and negation of each other. And so because of the impossibility of having an integration of these two things, which are required in order to even have the perspective of the ego, I think the ego can't even get off the ground. I mean, this is wrong, but let me just do it as a metaphor and as a vague kind of example. But I think this might be some species of ADHD as well, essentially, that if you try to have two sides of the mind that are performing the same theme, so the unconscious is trying to say, well, this is what I want, and the subconscious says, well, this is what I want. And then when you get to the inferior function, anxiety, these wants can sort of short circuit each other. So the want of the one, then, rather than having to tolerate the inferior function and grow and develop and mature, you essentially just say, well, now my wants are no longer in alignment, because both the subconscious and the unconscious are meant to be representing my internal inclination and wants, and my private drive and inclinations. But so they're just stuck in a contestation in which there's no way that they can both coexist and be integrated, and can lead on to developing a third perspective, like the ego. So I think that if you don't thematically, and in some sense I think that to a large extent, I think this is why some people are so much more mature than other people. So many people are so much psychologically developed and stable than other people, because maybe thematically people have learned, and I think that you can kind of pick this up from a kind of cultural osmosis as well, that this is how you internally order the different sides of the mind. But I think that opportunistically, when people mix and match to some degree, where essentially the parent function is not sticking to its theme, but it's playing some kind of magical trickery. It's trying to do some alchemy, and this never works because it's kind of like wishing a wish from a genie, and the genie is going to deliver exactly to the letter of what you say, but eventually by trying to perform this kind of alchemy, you end up uh, not getting what you want because the words end up meaning different things because you've kind of changed the antecedent sort of context of one side of the mind by trying to retrieve something. Or the example that I can give of this is if you were doing a very big mathematical equation that you were trying to work out what the answer was, and you realize that at a certain step that the numbers that you have working with could have been computed much easier if just the values were just slightly different. So it's almost as if you go back 2 steps and you change one of the numbers, um, because then you know that further down the line it'll be easier to crunch. It'll be easy, the numbers will just work better. There'll be less decimal places or less fractions or something like that because you'll just be dealing with whole numbers. But it's sort of you end up not answering the original question because you've essentially changed the question. You've changed the form of the question. A bit of a weak metaphor, but anyway. And so essentially and I think that effectively what's happening there is what you're doing is you're trying to, one parent function is ostensibly trying to inject its theme into another parent function. They're trying to say, well, let's do some horse trading on the side. You run cover for me, and become collusive or something like that. And so they don't perform according to their themes. They have sort of their fingers in different pies. And you think that you're getting a benefit in the short term, but in the long term, you end up with this very toxic form of internal impingement and tension between the sides of the mind, because you don't just get help from the other side of the mind, you also end up with a kind of judgment or a criticism, or a kind of, or some other feedback, which is not going to necessarily be directly between the parent functions, but it's going to precipitate in the death of the other side of the mind, because essentially it's going to change how that parent function deals with its local inferior function, which will essentially bleed into the next side of the mind because that inferior function becomes a death. Um, so I think that it's those kinds of messy things that occur when you don't have a very clear thematic distinction between the sides of the mind. And this probably accounts for a lot of psychopathological conditions. So I wanted to talk about those themes. So yeah, I mean, to a large extent, they might be completely different. To a large extent, I think this is almost like a culture. To a large extent, we get ideas and inspiration of this from our enculturation, from how we are raised, in terms of just how psychology is culturally, pedagogically transmitted. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting thing to bring up. And there was another point which I didn't explore, which was an important thing that I kind of left behind. Um, I don't think I want to explain again what sort of perfecting the vanity means in practice. let me just think if there was, because as I said, I recently explained this to someone and it gave me all these new ideas and things like that. So I'm just trying to think if I said anything that I didn't already say before in one of my prior recordings on this subject. Oh yeah, there was something. So essentially, it was very interesting. So when I was explaining this to him, he responded to me with something which, I mean, he was replicating what I was saying very well. He really did understand it, but it was interesting because I almost think it struck me how he was digesting it, and it very clearly I tried to give him a different kind of level of interpretation of what I was saying. Um, and because he said something, I can't even remember exactly what he said, but it kind of had a positive spin on what I was saying, and I was like, no, 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 no. Actually, how you should understand, I think, how you should contextualize the structures that I'm describing, is that the inferior function is painful, and it's so painful to your dominant function, or in some sense, it's so it's so hard for the parent function to contain the anxiety that is represented by the inferior function, that it tries to double down on that trauma. It tries to lock it in. It tries to cost it into the system of almost an external locus of control by inculcating it into a death for the new side of the mind to emerge from. But essentially, you can understand that the whole false ego complex is in some sense recycled trauma. That you have a general coping mechanism which ends up creating its own stress, its own internal anxiety in the form of the inferior function, and then the inferior function is being recycled into yet a further, more removed and more remote experience of the same sort of cascade or domino effect of what is essentially the initial trauma. And in some sense, there almost isn't an initial trauma, because the initial trauma is, you might say, the inferior function of the superego, which never existed, which is a kind of fictitious entity. So it's recycled trauma that is founded in essentially a lie. But you have to really be quite developed before you can kind of reach that sort of realization. But yeah, it just is so interesting, because essentially when you, I think, unmask, when you have a nice definition of what the false prophet is for your metatype or something like that, you can just understand, oh yeah, I mean, it was weird because I typed this person that I was talking to, and I mean, my typing might have been wrong, but I thought, this is how I type people. It's not very thorough, and I haven't developed psychometry, but essentially how I type people is I ask them what their strongest functions are, and then I talk to them usually about something or other. It doesn't really matter what. And I try to get a sense of what they're representing to me, and I just look at all my different metatype architectures, and I look through the 17 types, and I try fit what they've said their strong cognitive functions are, and I kind of fit what I think I'm listening to, because I think I can. There's a story that is told by the architecture. There's a very clear internal drama, an internal story, and I've already said that the summary of that drama is that essentially this whole personality develops in order to cope with an existential external locus of control. It's meant to cope with a god of the world that is represented by the false prophet function, the prime false prophet function. So in some sense, it's like in some sense, your personality is designed to cope with a form of existential anxiety which is represented. You have to justify your existence and cope with an existential challenge, or judgment. You have to cope with a kind of existential judgment of an external locus of control, which is represented by the false prophet. So, in some sense, it's like your whole existence is living under the shadow of this dominion, the dominion of this cognitive function, as your kind of environment. So you have to get along with it as an environmental, sort of metaphysical backdrop and context. So it's kind of like the meta context of your existence, that your personality evolved to cope with. And I'm explaining this so wrong. I can't find the perfect words, but maybe I've vaguely kind of described it well enough. It is interesting because I think there is a kind of adolescence. I remember exploring it perhaps myself, where I think before you get into the ego, you kind of get a preview. I think there might be a stage in development, or it might be because of trauma, I'm not sure, in which the superego, I think the superego can be revealed to you in the middle of the development of your false ego complex. And if you discover it in that way, you can kind of maybe create a very pathological sort of alliance with it, which also becomes a form of arrested development. And that might be somewhat connected to borderline personality disorder and narcissism, where essentially it's almost like you try to use the superego as your own parent. And you stop growing an internal locus of control for the positive side of your mind, and you just kind of, because you're basically working with a genie at that point. And the genie tells you that essentially everything is an illusion and it's just a game anyway, so you might as well have fun playing it instead of actually trying to fully develop it and graduate from it, or graduate from one side of the mind to developing the next side of the mind. That essentially knowing that it's fundamentally futile, but then instead of actually still doing the work anyway, and being done with the whole thing, or potentially done with the whole thing, and being part of this kind of idea that it's possible to kind of extricate yourself from it one day, instead you just kind of relent to it. And so there's no point in fully developing it and in operating it with any kind of fidelity or integrity, because that's not possible. So you just kind of conceptually just use it as a vehicle. And so you're almost like on the side of your superego in, you're kind of loving your own captivity or something like that. I mean, I think there really is something, there's almost something demonic about it, about that kind of, because they kind of get drunk on the power that it's all frivolous anyway. It's interesting. I mean, I think there is, I mean, what I'm saying is probably, in fact, more related to borderline personality disorder than it is to narcissism. I think in some sense, I'm not going to justify it fully in this recording, but I think narcissism is somewhat more tragic, whereas borderline personality disorder is somewhat more a concerted strategy uh, I think the reason why narcissism is more tragic is because narcissism ends up creating a mechanism in which the ego is subverted, but in some sense, it's it becomes a structural impediment that gets baked into it's a habit which then sort of locks you in. Whereas borderline personality disorder is an ongoing orchestration. It's a much more willful uh, yeah. So I am actually interestingly enough, I think it would be more easy to rehabilitate narcissists. I mean, it would still be difficult to fix any, but I think on some level, uh, uh, see, the problem is that uh, if you tried to help a borderline, uh, they wouldn't be interested in being helped. It's part of a performative strategy. Um, Whereas, uh, if a narcissist wanted to be helped, um, you could actually elicit from them genuine and authentic uh, responses. You wouldn't get disingenuousness. You wouldn't get the kind of never-ending dishonesty that you get from a borderline. I mean, they both have structural challenges to overcome, as it were, but in some sense, the you wouldn't have to worry that you with the narcissist at whether you had ascertained guiding them into finding the structural malformations to work on. Whereas a borderline is the whole thing is such a performative charade that everything you say is just a springboard to uh, more manipulation and more convolution, and it's just as I say, it's just an excuse in essence for more subversive power games and ways of extracting sympathy and control. Essentially, it's the abuse of trust. Essentially, the implicit and never-ending abuse of trust that makes borderlines essentially particularly uh, in some sense unreachable, or I mean, if they are reachable, it's a waste of time. But in terms of that, it's what I mean is that it's very rare. It's like when I say that, what I mean is that in conceptually, it is you're it's possible to reach them, but practically that's very hard to do, because essentially what you have to do is you have to participate in place of them because they can't participate. So you have to play both roles. So you have to narrate to them their lack of participation as if they were participating. So you have to tell them you have to resolve for them their own worries and their own, let's say, honest questions, which they're not never going to honestly deliver to you. So they don't have honest questions, but you have to still ask the honest questions that need answering on their behalf. And so you have to talk to them, and the problem is that they're not going to tell you if they don't understand a word that you use. They're not going to report this to you unless it's part of their strategy, unless it's part of their charade. So, it just becomes impossible uh, to get them to follow because they're not actively participating. They're only uh, pretending to, essentially, as they are trying to envelop you in some kind of trust game. And this is often, to the extent that you can get any kind of progress from a borderline, um, is that essentially you have to, in some sense, try to negotiate with them as to a form of manipulation that they are going to try on you that you can use in order to pedagogically educate them or sort of train them to exhibit sort of uh, a more responsible form of participation. Um, but in some sense, I mean, I'm very pessimistic about any sort of improvement of a borderline, because essentially I think what you're doing is you're essentially just weaponizing them, because the only reason why they would ever employ anything is because it's part of uh, delivering to them more ready access to what I won't talk about it for now, but essentially to being able to unilaterally project onto people and unilaterally dictate to people, and incept people within their introjective paradigm. So, you kind of have to offer them some kind of blood sacrifice, or at least, and the only way that you can train them to become more civilized or sociable in some sense is the idea that they're going to use it to get more access to more readily quantifiable upsides of parasitic extraction. Um, I think maybe, I mean, I need to think about this some more, but maybe a good summary of what is happening in borderline personality disorder is almost as if the false prophet becomes like the infant, becomes like the child of the positive side of the mind. It becomes seen as a kind of, as the protected uh, master, or but also the prized infant. That's an interesting way of cashing out the archetype of a devouring mother, that she is devouring reality and herself and anyone in order to protect, um, and exalt and serve uh, the false prophet, which kind of invalidates the ability of the positive side of the mind, the positive false elements or constituents of the false ego complex, for having an internal locus of control, because it has a direct relationship to this external locus of control. And so all the positive sides of the mind um, become a weird extension of the negative side of the mind, or the shadow side of the mind. Um, And so there's a kind of a perpetual sort of arrested development and a kind of homogenization between this quite bruised and fractured positive side of the mind into essentially openly worshipping the false prophet. In order to have this weird kind of undead quality to it. I really do think that the vampire archetype is a perfect replica of borderline personality disorder. Even the particular things you have to invite it into your home. It's very sort of superficial in a lot of ways. That you can kind of ward it off with strong smells of like garlic and things like that. It doesn't have a reflection. Where you kind of have to go quite abstract to explain some of these things, but anyway, and narcissism, I haven't thought about this enough, but let me see if I can just concoct something on the fly. What would narcissism be? Maybe it's part. In some sense, maybe the subconscious ends up worshipping the superego in the same way that the borderline does, but that the unconscious side of the mind is kind of cast adrift as an afterthought, as a separate sort of leftover, and the relationship between the false prophet and the subconscious is something that only works for the subconscious and is a kind of like a stable unit. And so the unconscious is kind of this kind of orphaned aftermath that the subconscious is satisfied to kind of leave in the lurch. And essentially the unconscious develops independently in a very beleaguered way, perhaps as well. And it doesn't therefore have the resources to ever kind of reach the ego, to develop into the ego, because it's kind of already is quite badly overshadowed by a dominant subconscious that never that is kind of so self-satisfied that the unconscious can only kind of mirror or try to partially reflect the structure, or partially sort of model itself sympathetically to what the subconscious is doing. But it's not capable of creating a morality out of it. It's not capable of creating a coherent worldview from its own internal mess. And so you kind of have a very dissatisfied and alienated unconscious side of the mind from the subconscious. And the subconscious, every now and again, sort of farms and ravages the unconscious and tries to kind of repurpose its insight and essentially the false self is almost like an aftermath is of the subconscious. So the subconscious, in some sense, wants to colonize the unconscious side of the mind, and it does so by trying to replicate itself, because it never wants to leave its self satisfaction in itself. So it tries to kind of create an avatar within morality. So it creates this weird kind of surreal, contorted, unconscious side of the mind that is capable of awarding to the subconscious what it already has within itself. And essentially, it just never fits, and the whole project is such a derogation of, let's say, the ordinary structure of things, that it just never reaches the ego, and so it doesn't have it doesn't have an operational ego. Um, I'll have to think about it some more, but anyway. I should just say as well that, the main difference between borderline and narcissism then is that borderlines actually do have an unconscious, and they do have an ego, uh, but they have a myriad variants of these things, and uh, essentially the only organizing principle of having these sides of the mind is having some kind of way to project. I think in some sense, maybe the false prophet is what they actually project onto people, so that they can have relationships with them, so that they can have relationships with their false prophet, essentially. And then in the audience of that, they can have the stability to connect with their ego and their subconscious and their unconscious, which can only have a kind of coherent existence in the presence of their organizing principle, which is essentially the false prophet. Anyway, I'm too tired to go into these topics, but yeah, there's definitely something to all of that. Okay, so this is going to be more embarrassing speculation about how to integrate metagram and metatype. I think I'm close to doing it. Uh, Again, I haven't got my ducks in a row, because I should at least have another person with their metagram type and metatype to kind of contrast, just so that I can get a feel for how the other types look. But in some sense, it's perhaps also not bad that I'm doing this in the dark of that, because then that can be used perhaps to be verification if it all lines up nicely with other types. Anyway, so I want to get a lot out of these things, out of the worship, the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the devotion, the oath, which is my particular sequence for my metatype. Perhaps I'm trying to get too much out of it, because I kind of have a feeling, although this might be wrong, but I have a strong inclination that, you see, and this is a slight contradiction, which is why it's a problem, is that I want it to be true that someone develops their emotional tones or digests them within the positive development of their false ego complex, but that they are there from the start as experiences, but then they become sort of structured into an internal locus of control, which is the positive development of the false ego complex. And I also, in some sense, want the emotional tones to be dispersed between the sides of the mind. Like, I want the first two emotional tones to essentially be the development of the subconscious, and I want the next two to be the development of the unconscious, and I want the last two to be the development of the ego. But the weird thing is that the actual constituent parts of each emotional tone comprise elements of all the sides of the mind. They're made out of all the sides of the mind. But I mean, that kind of, so the only way to kind of make sense of that, and because it is a slight contradiction, but it is something that can be explained, that essentially, that the emotional tones are experienced, and they can only fully be integrated when all of the six are being integrated. That only then do you actually have a proper internal locus of control. So in some sense you have a kind of a contingent internal locus of control over the first two emotional tones when they have been digested and sort of become the organizing principle over the subconscious. And then so you have a kind of contingent organizing principle over the subconscious, and then you develop a contingent organizing principle over the unconscious, and then as you develop the ego, you are redigesting those contingencies. And so anyway, that's why the development of the ego is the most arduous, or is the most precarious, or something like that. Is delicate. Uh, and now I kept on trying to think, how could I divide these things, so now I still want to do something like ground them all in the subconscious, but I think that might be wrong. That might be really a theoretical um, sort of an ungrounded sort of theoretical fantasy of mine. What is similar in concept to that, and might be a proper revision of that, is that the worship and the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the devotion, and the oath, which is my particular ordering for my metatype of my circuit, and all sattva circuits, start with a worship and then a declaration, is that perhaps these terms, worship, declaration, answer, prayer, they are not, they are grounded in essentially the slot itself. So essentially, I'm actually, and this has some resonance to me, some sort of deep resonance to me. I believe this is, I'm getting my memory of thinking about this originally comes up when I sort of toy with this idea, because so I mean, let me just say what I think the attribution is. So I think that the worship uh, the worship is the trial or the inferior function slot as well. The declaration is the lust or the child slot. The answer is the hero slot, or the vanity rather. The prayer is the parent function or the enticed lust. the devotion is the death, and the oath is the sin. So these are quite strange pairings. But the interesting thing about it is that, for example, so the worship is the trial, and the declaration is the lust or the child function. So it goes from inferior function to child function uh, in the sequence, because the sequence that I just read out is the same sequential flow between all metatypes. All sattva, rajas, and guna subtypes have the same flow, but they start at a different place. So tamas starts at the answer and the prayer, and then it goes devotion, oath, and then worship, declaration. Rajas starts with the devotion and the oath. So in some sense, tamas starts with the hero function and the parent function, or the vanity and the enticed lust, and rajas starts with the death and the sin. But sattva, if I'm correct in my apportioning of each subtype to these labels, starts with the trial, which is the inferior function, and the declaration, which is the child function. So sattva, right at the beginning, is confronted with this, with almost the trickiest aspect, because it's almost sattva is confronted with the end, because this is so complicated, but essentially there is an overlap within these 6 items, because the worship of one side of the mind is the trial of one, the inferior function of one side of the mind is in fact the death of another side of the mind. So the worship and the oath have a certain overlap, not a full overlap, but they do have the one is in some portion a kind of a repurposing of the other. So there's this weird and I just said the wrong thing. I was supposed to say the worship and the devotion. The worship and the devotion have a crossover, and the other thing is the oath and the declaration, because the oath is the sin, which is then another side of the mind's declaration, which is the lust or the child function. So sin is a child function, and the worship, which is the inferior function, is another side of the mind's devotion. But anyway, so that's interesting. The only thing that doesn't have an overlap is the answer and the prayer. And I would hazard a guess that this is why tamas are the most deluded by their own false ego, because their starting point, or their impetus into their whole sequence, starts off in such an opaque and solid, they know, they can be quite certain about their own false ego, whereas at least sattva is confronted right from the get-go by the inferior function, which is essentially the source of anxiety about the false ego complex, and then how that leads into they're almost, yeah, this is slightly contradictory to what I wanted to say, because I wanted to say that essentially the first two well, I wanted to sort of say that two emotional tones or in terms of the worship and the declaration together, would kind of, at least in the sattva type, would describe the development of the subconscious, and the next two would describe the development of the unconscious, and the last two would describe the development of the ego. And that might be a kind of a strange generalization, which is maybe like roughly has some truth to it, but that like technically is ambiguous, at least, or something like that. So this is a problem for me. Is that how can I explain that, or how can that be narrated? I mean, in some sense, these recordings are embarrassing because they're not. It's just trying to get a straight story. So, I mean, it's certainly embarrassing. It's just like playing with these things until I say something that sounds cogent. It's not a very high bar, but anyway. I mean, in some sense, you could say perhaps the emotional tone of the worship and the declaration, if you can understand the components of that in terms of the whole metatype architecture, then you understand that maybe the subconscious has to thematically do its job in the kind of environmental context of those emotional tones, in the kind of and it just so happens that sattva has the most, let's say, sophisticated pairing of its first two emotional tones, and so it forces the subconscious to, right from the get-go, sort of be a very nuanced, sort of intricate and sophisticated creature to cope with that burden, and that sophistication serves the sattva type, because then all the other stages that it has to develop on top of that are less sophisticated, and so it's easier to perform an integration between the three sides of the mind, because thematically the foundation of a sattva is more elaborate. Because, like, right from the beginning, the first thing that it has to concern itself with is reconciling um, the inferior function with the child function. And if I'm correct that essentially when I say it's not the inferior function of one side of the mind with the declaration, with the child function of another side of the mind, it's all the inferior functions with all the child functions in some sense. And so the kind of and now this is where things kind of get into almost science fiction, or it gets certainly embarrassing, because it's like saying, well, you're trying to use this emotional tone to understand uh, all of your inferior functions. But why would you be looking at your inferior functions when you're trying to understand your inferior functions? You need to be looking elsewhere. You need to be outsourcing that perspective into all the other sides of the mind. So it's like you're trying to anchor source material. You're trying to conduct a survey as to locating an internal this is the wrong word, but an internal impression. So you're trying to create sort of like an organizing principle, a correlating reference that will anchor that side of the mind. So in some sense, I think that the emotional tones are like scar tissue or collateral tension, which is how one side of the mind anchors itself. Sorry, not one side of the mind. One slot anchors itself in the entire compilated false ego complex, at least the positive false ego complex. And so you end up with, let's say, a general guidance. So, again, I just want to say that I think that these emotional tones have a quasi truth to them, because I think that in some sense metatype can fully digest them at some point, that they can essentially be trumped by the maturation of the metatype, that the metatype can fully integrate them and sort of transcend them to some degree. Um, but if it kind of doesn't play by the principles of the metatype, that might be a sign, like in a generalistic sort of way, that might be a sign of weak integration and sort of being prone to being internally kind of in internal tension and an internal sort of corrosion, because essentially the emotional tones were the original scaffolding, and many of the structures were initially directed or conducted in line, in alignment with the emotional tones. So I'm still sticking with this weird analogy that essentially the emotional tones are like the crib notes. They're like the sort of the stepping stones that you can kind of quickly uh, do so I mean I still would associate them in some way with the superego being a kind of external locus of control, but essentially I do think that that external locus of control can be supplanted by an internal locus of control in a maturely developed positive false ego complex. But there is a kind of oxymoronical sort of self-contradiction to that, because um, if you do that, you end up confronting the superego in the positive. You end up outlining it in your. You end up uncovering what you're projecting onto your environment as a projection. So it no longer becomes sort of the Wizard of Oz. It becomes a sort of a self delusion. It becomes, oh, I've created this fictitious boogeyman that I'm projecting onto my environment. So it's like you can experience the superego in two ways: in the positively developed image and in the negatively sort of unconscious environmental shadow. To use the kind of the maybe some Jungian jargon. Kind of environmental unconsciousness, not to do with my labeling of one of, because in my system the unconsciousness is a positive side of the mind, i.e. the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego. Okay. Uh, so I think I'm right and I'm wrong. I'm kind of wrong when I say that essentially the worship in the declaration will be apportioned to the subconscious and the altar, and the prayer will be apportioned to the unconscious and the devotion, and the oath will be apportioned to the ego. I'm kind of right and I'm wrong about that. there is perhaps something closer to the idea that, well, when you're developing any side of the mind, you probably have to reintegrate all six objects. And in some sense, the further down the line you get, the more internal corrosion and weakness in earlier structures are going to be conspicuously felt and burdened, and burden the new development. And you have to go back and you have to kind of clean up what then have to be sort of relabeled as contingent things that now need to be revised in the development of this emotional chain, or the circuitry of emotional tones. And so, in some sense, when you are in the ego, that you are more focused with your, let's say, crowning integration, which is the last two in the chain. So in some sense, it's probably true that the subconscious gets supercharged by the worship and the declaration, and in some sense, the hardest aspect of development is the last two that have to kind of be, in almost like building a tower. You have to kind of complete the top of the tower in the ego, and at the same time you have to go back and reinforce and revise um, the earlier structures, or the middle structures at least, perhaps even the ones right at the bottom. Um, and I do think that there is perhaps something to the idea that when you are developing the unconscious, it's one of the most difficult stages of development, because as you are developing the unconscious, your relationship to the superego, I think that there is a kind of a pivotal developmental phase in which one perhaps gets, I mean, maybe this is not so common. Uh, I feel like perhaps it is, but this is slight conjecture, that one gets reintroduced to the superego, or one rediscovers the superego, and one really commits to either having a positive development and developing an internal locus of control, or having some kind of internal alignment where one tries to consciously structure and develop the false ego complex in a kind of in a conscious alliance with the superego, rather than supplanting it, trying to exalt the superego and try to sort of reify the false prophet, which I've already described as a kind of fictitious entity. And so when you do that, you end up with this kind of structuring into your false ego complex a kind of projective mechanism where you are overtly projecting the false prophet onto either, a kind of an object in your environment, and that might sort of happen in two senses. It might happen in that that you're not capable of projecting it onto your environment, but it's a game that you're playing, and so you're kind of you you confine yourself into a certain kind of insane captivity, that you believe that this is all just a game anyway, so you don't have to kind of operate your false ego complex with any kind of fidelity or integrity, because there's no hope of ever kind of extricating yourself from it. So you just kind of sort of domesticate yourself in line with the superego, and that involves sort of half projecting. I mean, I'm kind of describing maybe something like what I have described in other recordings as sort of cerebral histrionic presentations and borderline personality disordered presentations. And so, generally, the relevance of being sattva, rajas, or tamas is just, naturally speaking, the earlier the circuit, or the earlier the emotional tone comes in the circuit, the more structure, the more predominant it's going to be, essentially. The more, relatively speaking, the more structured it's going to be. So a sattva is going to have their inferior function developed beyond. So in some sense, sattva is going to be weighted towards their inferior function and towards their child function. And in some sense, the grouping of those two things is almost a self-refutation. Because if you first understand your inferior function and then you understand your child function, you know already that your child function doesn't have a leg to stand on, because it's been associated or correlated right from the start to its, in some sense, it's almost like its mortal enemy. Because the inferior function is exactly what invalidates a child function and takes you to a new child function. So in some sense, the codex between the thing that determines which side of the mind that you're actually focused on is the beginning insight that a sattva personality will. So in some sense, there's an internal coherence that sattva naturally have. That they somewhat already begin with knowing the limits of their own internal structure, or at least the outline of it, the shape of it, so that they can navigate and know very clearly which side of the mind that they are situated within, because they kind of have the most contingent aspects of it forefront in their So I would say sattva personalities are first troubled by their inferior function, and then they use that being troubled by their inferior function to access their child functions. And that is the core of their drive, is that they want to develop access to their child functions via or in conjunction with understanding or surveying their own inferior slot. So they end up with, I would say, much more carefully derived false ego complexes. And tamas is develops solely from the start around their hero function and parent function. So tamas, let's say, have a natural predisposition to having, ontologically speaking, and therefore the most predominant structures within the false ego complex is their dominant function and their parent function. So and they will then, moving on from that, rajas are the death and the sin. That's actually quite strange, because the death and the sin both do not exist as, is one of the four, which MBTI, MBTI is an approximation. So I mean, I use its jargon as a translation of some things, because the concepts overlap quite heavily. But so the devotion is the death, and the oath is the sin. So they go from the death to the sin. I just want to contrast that to sattva, because sattva goes from the inferior function to the child function, which, if you kind of understand that, that's going backwards. That because the inferior function comes after the child function. But rajas goes from the death to the sin. So their core nexus of their type is a kind of, in some sense, I would say it's characteristic by its opening two emotional tones covers the width and the breadth in a sequitur sequence, in a sequitur flow between the beginning and the end of the slot. So in some sense, I think that the Rajas is horribly framed by understanding the nature of I don't know, they are horribly outlined, sort of encased within the false ego complex. So it's strange, is that tamas is almost lost within the false ego complex because it's sort of it's manifests, its nexus is right in the center of it, whereas rajas, its nexus is a whole sequitur. Um, but then I guess it is rajas is not completely lost because its next sequence is the same as the sattva's opening sequence, which is the worship and the declaration. So then, rajas goes from the death and the sin to the inferior, and then going backwards from the inferior to the child function. So it goes death, sin, inferior, child function. And I think that what I'm describing is almost a kind of cadence. And I think that the wonderful thing about my typology, it really is, and I think I have just cracked this, I think this is what's going on, is that typing becomes so much more holistic. It becomes so much more the facets of it, the properties of the types. You see them animated in such detail. I mean, there was something that I wanted to emphasize in the last recording, which I don't think I included in the last recording. I mean, I did mention it, but I just wanted to talk about it some more in terms of how essentially one of the things that you can only appreciate from metatype, um, actually also I guess you'd have to integrate metagram into this insight as well to get it fully rendered, but essentially I said that specifically the hero function, the parent function, and the inferior function and the sin of the ego is untethered to the rest of the false ego complex. It's like a completely free agent in some sense, and you can consciously direct it because it's not part of the metatype architecture that is reused essentially. Because so I mean, I guess what I'm saying there is that there is a structural component in the answer and prayer and worship and oath, which is untethered to, because the ego component of the answer, prayer, worship, and oath is doesn't follow that horrible thing where essentially that the oath is the declaration of another side of the mind, and the worship is a devotion in another side of the mind. So in some sense, I think that that you might also make an argument that those components are kind of in a limbo, and perhaps you can also just say that they do not actually form part of the worship, the declaration, the answer, the prayer, the devotion, the oath. They are kind of beyond that. They kind of sit as a cloud above it. Anyway, although that is also perhaps contradicted because the emotional tone itself might include it. The actual emotional tones themselves, which take on the name worship, declaration, answer, prayer, might have as a constituent part of it that thing. And so in some sense that floating cloud is perhaps tethered by the emotional tones themselves. And so you might have some aspects within that cloud which are fully free, and some which are not bound by the metatype architecture, but bound by the metagram circuitry. And that, I think, is a bit of a war zone. That, I think, is a war that can be won, where essentially if you grow this internal locus of control, you can extricate the metagram, you can overcome the metagram circuitry and essentially become a metatype, sort of isotope of your personality, as a kind of precursor to perhaps some kind of therapeutic progression or path or something like that. And that's why I talk about perfecting the vanity, and I think I did try to cover that in the last recording and update it with any new insights that I had. And essentially, I think the only thing that I didn't originally talk about when I talked about perfecting the vanity in some of my old recordings is that I didn't talk about what the lust really is, and how the lust is, how the child function is fueled by this recycled trauma and anxiety over the inferior function, which is in some sense fictitiously donated to the subconscious by the superego as it's sort of initiating impulse. So I think that in some sense, maybe the first step in sort of perhaps a therapeutic self-actualization or whatever would be to disintegrate the hold of metagram and to understand the particular, to kind of, I guess you would have to first sort of be educated as to the general gist of metatype, and then you would be explained your metagram circuitry, and then you would just kind of deconstruct or dissolve some of those metagram circuitry things in isolation. I think specifically emotional tones that have as their components the kind of the destructive emotional tones that occlude, so I think understanding how sort of the emotional tones that have occlusions of cognitive functions can be seen, at least from a meta type perspective, as creating a sort of a jumble of sort of conflagration of an entangled sort of antagonism and an internal tension, which just becomes a kind of inescapable problem. So you can almost, on a technical level, you can see why those sort of types that create occlusions are undesirable. Perhaps you would understand the style of your emotional tone circuitry and understand perhaps the seduction of it, but then also understand the fundamental futility of it in terms of how it's just a coping mechanism for the prime false prophet, for the superego. And so you raise this idea, this concept of an internal locus of control, and you kind of access new freedoms within your metatype circuitry, or metatype architecture rather. And then in principle, you've kind of already started the war, you've started the antagonism, which then, once you kind of know everything in terms of the metatype architecture back to front, that then you can feel confident and ready that it's okay to leave it behind, and that it's possible to pack it up. It's possible to extricate yourself from it and disengage from it, and sort of imagine the rehabilitated metatype architecture constituents, and then essentially you kind of knock down the prime domino, which is essentially the rehabilitation of the cognitive function that is inhabited by the prime false prophet, which is sort of confining the false prophet to the lake of fire in perhaps archetypal terms. But anyway, at least all these constituents, I think, now have a story that roughly works. It's just the problem is that MBTI is so simple that it's so easy to sort of say, oh yeah, that's insightful, and my system is so much more detailed and so much more particular and it's so much richer, but it does require you to kind of really bend your ear into the whole sort of narrative and such. But there are some aspects to it which I think can resonate with people as seeming very insightful, in terms of how I describe the relationship between the inferior function and the role of the parent function in supporting the dominant function, um, and the weird kind of antagonism, but also connection of service between the dominant function and the child function. That when I explore that, it has a sort of a level of explanation and depth which is somewhat lacking in general MBTI sort of things. Anyway,